The man stood on a stack of shipping crates, two burned hands pressed together in front of him, and didn't move, when the first laugh broke open beneath his feet. Half his face wasn't a face anymore. The auctioneer called $6. Nobody answered. He dropped to $4. Another laugh, meaner this time. Near the front, somebody muttered something about the face, loud enough to carry the whole length of the street. He heard it. Everybody knew he heard it. Because nothing on him moved at all. 11 minutes. The wind pushed dust through the crowd's boots, dry and white. Somewhere behind them a horse stamped, restless. Nobody settled it. $2, then, the auctioneer said, his voice gone thin and bitter. Will no woman give me $2? Silence. Then, from the back of the crowd, a hand went up. The wind came down off the ridge, that morning carrying dust, and the smell of dry grass, and Clem Calloway was already 3 hours into her day, before the sun cleared the cottonwoods. She had a fence post half set. A calf with a torn ear, that needed watching. A ledger open on the kitchen table, with numbers that didn't like her much lately. For years she'd run this place alone. For years since her father went down off a green horse, and broke something inside him, that never mended right, and finally, on a cold morning in March, just stopped. She remembered the silence after. How the house had never been that quiet before. How she'd stood in the doorway of his room for a long time, not crying, just standing, because there was a horse to feed, and a debt to the bank, and grief was a luxury item she couldn't put on credit. So she didn't cry. She worked. She learned the difference between a fence that would hold through a Dakota winter, and one that wouldn't. She learned which of the hired men could be trusted with a branding iron, and which couldn't be trusted with anything. She learned to keep her books so clean that Ezra Whitcomb, who ran the only bank the county had twice tried to hire her to run his own ledgers, and twice she'd told him no. Because the ranch didn't run itself. Because somebody had to be there when the sky went that particular shade of green before a storm. Because, and this part she never said out loud to anybody, sitting behind a desk all day felt like a kind of dying she wasn't ready for. What the town of Ironwood Flats did not know about Clem Calloway, because she'd never once offered it up, was this. Before the ranch. Before her father's fall. She'd spent 3 years, as a nurse in an Army field hospital outside Fort Randall, and 2 more, after that riding a wide circuit, with an old frontier doctor named Silas Rourke, who had taught her more about fevers, and wounds, and the sound a man's breath makes right, before it stops than any hospital ward ever could. She had set bones by lamplight. She had pulled a breech calf, and a breech baby in the same terrible week, once, and never told anyone, which one had scared her more. She had learned, young, that competence doesn't ask permission. And it doesn't wait to be liked. She'd moved her own well, that first summer alone. 60 paces from the privy, over the loud objections of a hired man, who called it a fool's errand, and too much digging for no good reason. She never explained why. Nobody had asked. She kept a narrow cot in the lean-to off her kitchen. Clean linen folded on a shelf above it. 3 years, and nobody had ever needed it. But Doc Rourke had taught her one thing above everything else he'd taught her, and it had lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs, and never left. The sick always come. Sooner or later. And the place that's ready for them is the place that survives them. She courted no man in 4 years. Not for lack of asking, there'd been asking, plenty of it, from men who liked the sound of 110 acres more than they liked the sound of her opinions. There was a Norwegian named Halvorsen who'd come around twice a year, with wildflowers and a proposal, and she'd turned him down twice a year, gently, because gentleness cost nothing, and honesty cost him nothing either. There was a cousin of the mercantile owner, passing through, who'd made the mistake of telling her exactly how her ranch ought to be run, and never made it back for a second visit. There was, if she was honest, with the ledger of her own life the way she was honest, with the ranches, a loneliness underneath all of it, that she'd learned to plow under like a bad crop, folded back into the soil, before it could take root, and choke anything else. Ironwood Flats had decided, the way small towns decide things, quietly, and all at once, and without anybody voting on it, that Clem Calloway was married to that ranch. Too hard for anything softer. And Clem had let them decide it. Because it left her in peace. Because peace, out here, was worth more than being understood. 300 miles east, in a town that didn't matter anymore to the man standing at its edge, Zeke Cross was not thinking about peace. He was thinking about the weight of $2 silver in another man's pocket, and how that number kept getting smaller the longer he stood still. 6 years before, that September, Zeke Cross had been a private posted to a supply depot outside Fort Dodge. Quiet. Steady. The kind of soldier the men under him trusted, with their gear, and their gripes, which was more than could be said for the lieutenant running that depot. A man named Duval. Duval kept a bottle in his desk drawer, and a grudge against anyone who noticed. It was Duval's carelessness, with a lamp, one dry August night, the kind of night the whole territory seemed to be holding its breath, that set the depot's forage barn burning, with 4 sleeping men still inside it. Zeke went in through the smoke. Twice. He carried 2 men out on his own back. Dragged a third out by the collar, choking, boots scraping a black trench, through the dirt. The fire took the left side of his face doing it. Took most of the use of his right hand. And by the time he stopped being able to see, through the smoke enough to go back a third time, the roof had come down. With the 4th man still inside it. His name had been Corporal Amos Trent. Zeke had known him 3 years. Had eaten 100 meals across from him. Had heard, more than once, about a girl back in Ohio, that Trent meant to marry, once his enlistment ran out. Zeke never met that girl. Never got the chance to tell her what her man had done in his last minutes, how he'd been shouting directions to the others even, as the smoke closed over him, thinking of everybody, but himself right up, until there wasn't any himself left to think with. Duval convened a board of inquiry. And a board of inquiry, it turned out, was a very easy thing to steer, when you were the one holding the lamp, that started it, and 2 frightened privates, who wanted to keep their postings. The official finding, Private Cross had been ordered to stand watch outside. Instead he'd run in against orders. Delayed the rescue. Cost the 4th man his life, through recklessness masquerading as bravery. Conduct unbecoming. Discharged inside a month. And no amount of scarring on a man's own hands, it turned out, argued very loudly against a signed report, with an officer's name at the bottom of it. Zeke drifted 3 years after that. Day labor no man wanted to hire twice, because a face like his drew a story behind it whether the story was true, or not, and the story, that followed him, from town to town was always some version of the same word. Coward. Never once the truth of what his hands had actually done in that barn. He worked a season on a cattle drive out of Abilene, until the trail boss heard the word coward whispered by a hand who'd known him at Fort Dodge, and let him go quiet at the next town, no explanation offered, because none was needed. He dug post holes in Missouri. Split rails in Kansas. Slept in more barns than he cared to count, and none of them burned, though he woke some nights certain he could smell smoke, that wasn't there. He was 2 days, from sleeping in a rail yard, flat broke, when a heavy-set man named Otis Pratt found him outside a feed store, and offered him passage west, a clean shirt, and a share of whatever price he brought. In exchange for standing on a platform in front of strangers. Zeke didn't care for the arrangement. He cared less for hunger. One season, he told himself. Just until I've got a stake somewhere nobody knows my name. He kept telling himself, that the whole way to Ironwood Flats, Dakota Territory. Right up until the moment he stood on a stack of shipping crates, and heard a woman's voice cut, through 11 minutes of laughing silence like it had every right to be there. The freight office sat at the west edge of town, and by 10, that morning a crowd had gathered outside it the way crowds gather for anything that promises to be either useful or entertaining, and this one promised both. Otis Pratt had brought 6 men west that season. 5 of them had gone quick. A widow with 3 young children and 100 acres took the blacksmith's helper, before the bidding fairly started. A spinster who ran the boarding house alone bought a shy young clerk, who blushed clean, through his own sale. A sheep-raising woman, from out past Turkey Creek got a quiet carpenter, and laughed the whole ride home, according to everybody, who watched her go. A widower farmer traded his old plow horse, and a season's promise of eggs for a lanky Missourian, who turned out, by spring, to be the best hand, with a wheat crop the man had ever employed. The 6th man stood in silence. 11 minutes. Which doesn't sound like much, until you've stood, through it yourself, in front of 100 strangers deciding out loud, in real time, exactly how little you're worth. Zeke's head was down. His 2 burned hands were pressed together in front of him, and his eyes were fixed on some point past the last row of onlookers, the particular kind of stillness a man holds, when he's already decided the staring can't reach him anymore. Except it could. Except every word landed anyway, and he just didn't let it show. Pratt started the bidding at $6. A strong, capable man, he called out. War-tested. Steady. Good for any outfit in the county. Nothing. He dropped to 4. A man near the front laughed. Not kindly. Somebody behind him grumbled something about the face, loud enough to carry the whole length of the crowd, and Zeke heard it. You could tell he heard it. Because nothing on him moved at all. $2, then. The number came out of Pratt thin and mean, because $2 was an insult, and every soul standing there knew it, and Pratt knew it best of all, and he said it anyway, because a season's investment walking home unsold was worse than an insult. Will no woman give me 2? That was when Clem Calloway, who had ridden into town that morning for barbed wire, and a sack of nails, and absolutely nothing else, heard her own voice say it, before her mind had finished deciding to. I'll give 2. She didn't entirely know why the words came out of her that way. She'd spent a fair portion of that winter working out the answer. What she knew, standing there with her hand half raised, and every head in the street swinging around to find her, was this. She'd watched that man take it. The laughing. The muttering. The long ugly silence stretching past what any decent crowd should let a silence stretch. And something in her had simply refused. Refused to let that silence be the last thing that ever happened to him in front of people. Pratt's grin came roaring back to life, so fast it looked painful. Sold, he crowed, before Clem could think better of it, as if thinking better of it were a thing he needed to prevent, urgently, before the crowd's attention wandered off somewhere else. To the lady with the barbed wire. For $2. There were papers. That surprised her more than the bidding had. Pratt produced a printed marriage contract of the rough frontier kind, and a small worn Bible to swear on, and word was sent 2 doors down for the circuit clerk, who was drinking coffee, and would, for 2 bits extra, make the whole business legal on the spot. Clem hadn't ridden into Ironwood Flats that morning planning to get married behind a freight office. But the scarred man was watching her now. Level. Waiting. Patient in a way that had nothing soft in it, and everything honest. And she understood, standing there with the crowd's eyes still on her, that backing out now, after the bid, after the crowd, after that word sold had already gone ringing down the street, would be a crueler thing than the bid itself. So the clerk dipped his pen. And Zeke spoke his first full sentence to her. You don't have to. Quiet. Carrying more education in it than his patched coat did. You made your point plain enough for everybody here. Pay Mr. Pratt his $2. Ride on home. I'll think well of you the rest of my life for it. A pause. Nobody would blame you. Clem looked at him a long moment. Do you want me to ride on home? He considered that. The same level honesty he seemed to give everything, even the things that had every right to make him bitter, and somehow hadn't. No. Another pause. Longer. I've got $11, and no people west of Missouri. And a face that costs me every door I knock on for work. I'd rather take my chances on a woman who bid when nobody else would, than ride back on Pratt's wagon. He looked at her directly then. First time. But I won't have you doing it out of pity. I've watched pity curdle in better people than either of us. It isn't pity. She said it plainly. And then, because it was true, and she only just then realized it was true, she said the rest of it slower. I don't rightly know what it is yet. But it isn't that. So they signed. His name, in a plain steady hand despite the ruined fingers. Zeke Cross. The clerk pronounced them married. Pocketed his 2 bits. Went back to his coffee like he'd just witnessed nothing more remarkable than a horse trade. What was left of the crowd watched the scarred stranger climb up, onto a rancher's wagon beside a spool of barbed wire, and a sack of nails, and shook their heads at the strangeness of the whole thing, and went home to tell their wives. Clem clucked to the team. Zeke sat straight-backed beside her, hat low, and watched Ironwood Flats fall away behind him. When the town was a mile gone, the whole account came out of him. Plainly. Unhurried. No reaching for her sympathy in it anywhere. His face. His name. The depot. The fire. The 4 men. Lieutenant Duval's lie, and the 2 frightened privates who'd backed it word for word, because their own postings mattered more to them than his did. He told her, because he'd rather she have the truth, from him first than a false version, from somebody in town later. Clem listened. Didn't interrupt once. When he finished, there was a long stretch of just wheels turning, and wind moving, through dry grass. You went in twice. I went in twice. Then Ironwood Flats has been calling a brave man a coward for 6 years. A beat. And that's their error. Not yours to carry. It came out of her the way everything did, a fact laid down plain, for use, no decoration on it anywhere. And something in Zeke's chest turned over that he didn't yet have a name for. Her place, when they reached it, sat small and square on Antelope Creek, better kept than most bachelor outfits 3 times its size. Zeke walked through it slow. The eye of a man who'd slept in worse barns than her tack room. He saw the narrow cot in the lean-to. The chest of clean linen stacked above it. What's this for? For when the sick come. She said it the way she said most things. Flat. Final. They always come. Sooner or later. I'd rather be ready, and wrong for 3 years than caught out once. She showed him the well. 60 paces from the privy. Dug that way on purpose, the summer she took the ranch over alone. Zeke looked at the distance. Looked at her. That's the first sensible piece of engineering I've seen west of the Missouri line. Clem, who did not know, yet that she liked being complimented on her engineering, found, standing there in the yard, with the wind picking up, that she did. There was a hinge on the tack room door, that had squealed for 2 years. Clem had stopped hearing it the way a person stops hearing their own clock. The second morning, before she'd finished her coffee, Zeke had it off. Oiled. Rehung. Quiet as a held breath. Clem opened and shut that door 3 times just to hear the nothing, where the noise used to be. And laughed. Short. Surprised. Out loud. First time in longer than she could easily place. Zeke looked at the coffee pot. Looked at the woman laughing at a door hinge. And thought that whatever he'd walked into, it was not what Otis Pratt had sold him into. The first weeks were a careful kind of quiet. Two strangers married behind a freight office don't become easy with one another overnight, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Clem kept to the work. Gave Zeke room to find the shape of the place. Zeke kept to the work she gave him. Wanted no more of her than that. But small things stacked up. The way small things do, between two people paying close attention, without saying so. Clem noticed his burned hand stiffened badly on cold mornings. Started leaving a pair of lined gloves by the door, before she ever mentioned it. Zeke noticed she never sat to eat, until the stock was fed, and the last chore closed out. Started closing chores faster, so her plate wouldn't sit cold, waiting on her. Neither of them mentioned either kindness. That was how it went. An act done. Not mentioned. An understanding built one unspoken thing at a time, brick by brick, in a language that didn't need words, because words would only have gotten in the way of it. He learned the shape of the ranch faster, Clem admitted to herself, than she'd expected of a man who'd spent 3 years drifting instead of working steady. He learned which of the two dogs answered to whistle, and which only answered to her voice specifically. He learned that the north pasture flooded first in a hard rain, and started, without being asked, digging a shallow channel to carry the water off, before it could pool, and rot the grass roots. He didn't ask permission for any of it. He simply did it, the way a man does, when he spent years being told what to do by people, who didn't deserve to be telling him anything, and has decided, quietly, that competence is the one thing nobody can take back, from him twice. Ironwood Flats did not let the marriage go easily. Small towns rarely do. When Clem brought Zeke in for supplies, conversation dropped low, and rose again behind their backs. The $2 husband, that was the name, that followed him, spoken when the town thought he couldn't hear it, and sometimes when the town knew he could, and said it anyway. Children stared openly at the scar. The women who set the temperature of that small place, who decided who counted, and who didn't, without ever holding a vote on it, drew their skirts in a little, when the two of them passed. As though a burned face, and a public humiliation behind a freight office were things that might rub off on decent people. The hardest of them was Augusta Whitcomb. Banker's wife. Wife of Ezra Whitcomb himself, the same man, who held Clem's note at the Territorial Bank, and had twice tried, and failed to hire her to keep his books. Augusta ran the church committee, the social calendar, and the unwritten law of, who in Ironwood Flats counted, as respectable, 3 jobs she'd appointed herself to, and performed with the grim satisfaction of a woman, who believed God himself had given her the position. She made a particular point one afternoon, in the Mercantile, of discussing Zeke in the third person, while he stood 4 feet away comparing 2 spools of fence wire. Some women, Augusta informed her companion, not troubling to lower her voice, because lowering it would have defeated the entire purpose, will marry any broken thing that rides into town. Just to say they've got a man in the house. A pause. For effect. In my day, a woman had standards. And if she couldn't find a husband honestly, she went without. Clem set down the bolt of cloth she'd been considering. Didn't raise her voice either. In your day, ma'am, I expect a great many women went, without a great many things. And named it virtue for lack of a better word for the shortage. She picked the cloth back up. I'll take 3 yards of this. Wool. And a paper of needles. A beat. My husband and I have a long winter of mending ahead of us. My husband. She let the words stand plainly. Claimed it out loud, in front of the whole store, and Zeke, 2 aisles over, pretending real interest in a coil of rope he had no earthly use for, felt something turn over in his chest he still didn't have a name for. Augusta went the color of a ripe tomato. Threw out something sharp about impudence. But the seed was planted. And seeds grow whether or not the gardener approves of them. 2 other women in that Mercantile went home thinking privately that the $2 husband's wife had more spine in her than the banker's own. They kept it to themselves. And they remembered it. At night, in the small square house on Antelope Creek, Zeke lay in the narrow room off the kitchen, the one Clem had given him, not the lean-to, with the cot for the sick, a different room entirely, one with an actual bed in it, and a window that looked out on the creek, and he did the thing he always did, before sleep found him. He went back through it. Which he told himself he wouldn't do. Except he always did. The lamp. Duval's hand on the bottle before the fire. The board of inquiry, and the way the room had smelled like polished wood, and other men's certainty. The two privates, who wouldn't meet his eyes, while they lied him out of a uniform. Because that's what 6 years does to a man's nights. It doesn't leave. It just gets quieter, and quieter, until you start to think it's gone, and then some small thing, a smell, a sound, a stranger's laugh in a crowd, and there it is again, exactly as loud, as the day it happened. He'd think, I did the right thing. And then, did I? And then, immediately, angrily, because the doubt still had teeth in it, after 6 years, of course I did. I went in twice. I carried 2 men out on my own back. Which didn't matter. Which had never mattered, not to the board, not to the 2 privates, not to a single town he'd passed through since. So why did it matter now? Lying in a bed he hadn't earned, in a house that belonged to a woman who'd bought him for the price of a sack of nails, listening to the creek move outside the window. Until he heard, faintly, through the wall, the sound of Clem still awake in the next room. Ledger pages turning. The particular quiet of someone doing sums that don't like them back. And he thought, not about the fire, for once, not about Duval, not about the 4 men, and the one who didn't come out. He thought about door hinges. About how a woman could laugh, short and surprised, at silence where noise used to be. And that, somehow, was the thought that let him sleep. Clem, for her part, was not thinking about ledgers, that night, though the ledger was open in front of her, and she was making a good show of it. She was thinking about the well. About the cot in the lean-to, that had sat empty for 3 years, waiting for something she'd never told a living soul she was actually waiting for. She'd told Zeke it was for, when the sick come. That was true. It just wasn't the whole of it. The whole of it, the part she'd never said to Doc Rourke, never said to her father, before he died, never said to the mirror on the morning she caught herself looking too long into it, was, that some nights, out here alone on 110 acres, with a debt at the bank, and a dead man's ranch on her back, she'd lain awake wondering what exactly she was keeping herself ready for. Because a person doesn't move a well 60 paces for no reason. Doesn't keep a cot made up for 3 empty years out of simple caution. There's caution. And then there's a woman quietly building a life shaped like a purpose she hasn't found yet. She looked down at the ledger. At numbers that told her, plainly, the way numbers always told the truth even when people didn't want to hear it, that the note at Whitcomb's bank was going to be a hard one to carry, through another winter without help. She told herself that was the practical reason. That a spare pair of hands, even scarred ones, even hands that shook a little on cold mornings, was worth $2, and a public spectacle, purely as a matter of arithmetic. She almost believed it. Except she kept hearing it. Her own voice, cutting through 11 minutes of laughing silence like it had every right to be there. I'll give 2. Not I'll pay $2 for a hired man. I'll give 2. There was a difference in those words, and she knew it, sitting there at her kitchen table, with the lamp burning low, and she wasn't ready, yet to look straight at what the difference meant. So she didn't. She closed the ledger. Blew out the lamp. And lay awake a good, while longer than the numbers required, listening to the house settle, and to the sound, faint, through the wall, of a man in the next room finally going quiet. Word of the wedding reached the sheriff's office by noon the next day, the way word reached everywhere in Ironwood Flats, sideways, through 3 mouths, each one adding a little color that hadn't been there the first time. Sheriff Amos Beddoe heard it, from his deputy, who'd heard it, from a boy who'd been loitering by the freight office for the sole purpose of watching things happen to other people. Beddoe was not a man given to strong opinions about other people's marriages. He'd worn the badge 11 years by then, long enough to have watched every kind of foolishness a frontier town could produce, and long enough to have learned that most of it sorted itself out one way or another without his help. But he was a man who kept a mental ledger of his own, not numbers, faces, and he filed this one away, without quite knowing why he bothered. Scarred stranger. Calloway Ranch. $2. He'd think of it again, later. Differently. But that morning it was just a curiosity, one more strange thing, that had happened at the edge of a town, where strange things happened, with some regularity, and were mostly forgotten by supper. Otis Pratt, meanwhile, was 3 towns gone by the time anyone in Ironwood Flats thought to wonder about him twice, and he carried, with him something he hadn't mentioned to Zeke Cross, or to anyone else standing in that crowd. Because there was a second arrangement. A quieter one. A man had come to Pratt back in Kansas City, well-dressed, careful with his words, the kind of man who paid for things in advance, and never explained why, and asked, casually, whether a certain scarred veteran named Cross might be traveling west, with Pratt's outfit that season. Pratt had said he might. The man had said, in that case, there'd be a little extra in it for Pratt, if the fellow didn't sell. If he came back east instead, still available. Still unclaimed. Still exactly where a man might know where to find him. Pratt hadn't asked why. A man in his line of work learned early not to ask why, so long as the money was good, and the request wasn't outright illegal, and this one, strange as it was, technically wasn't. He'd taken the money. And then Cross had gone, and gotten himself bought by a rancher, with barbed wire, and a spine, $2 and a public wedding, and there wasn't a thing Pratt could do about that now except pocket what he'd already been paid, and ride on, and hope the well-dressed man never came asking why his quiet arrangement hadn't held. Pratt didn't know the well-dressed man's name. Wouldn't have recognized it, if he had, because the man had never given one, had simply paid, and instructed and left, the way a certain kind of officer learns to give orders, without ever once putting his own name to them. 300 miles away, in an office, with a window that looked out over a rail yard, a man in a captain's uniform was reading a letter about survey routes through Dakota Territory, and thinking, not for the first time, about a private he'd once discharged for cowardice. He'd paid good money, over 3 years, to a string of men like Pratt, men who moved through the kind of towns where a scarred drifter might wash up, men who'd take a few dollars to keep an eye out and report back, or better still, to keep the fellow moving, before he could put down roots deep enough to grow a witness, or a grudge, into something dangerous. Because that was the truth Garrick Duval carried quiet beneath his uniform, year after year. That a man discharged for cowardice, drifting and unmoored, and easy to dismiss, was no threat at all. But a man discharged for cowardice, who stopped drifting. Who put down roots. Who married, and built, and started to matter to people, who might one day ask questions about how he came to lose his uniform in the first place. That man was a different kind of problem entirely. Duval had lost track of Cross for the better part of a year, the string of paid eyes finally going cold somewhere past Missouri, and he'd told himself it didn't matter anymore. That enough years had passed. That whatever Cross had become, wherever he'd landed, the story was old news, buried under 6 years of silence, and a signed report nobody had reason to dig up again. He traced a line on the map now, west, toward a county he'd never had reason to think about before, and told himself this was simply business. Grade lines and easements and government money. He did not yet know the name on the deed of the ranch that line was about to run past. Wondering, idly, whether the territory the railroad was about to cut through might, by some old and ugly coincidence, run close enough to find out what had become of a man he'd spent 3 years quietly making sure he'd never have to think about again. None of that reached Antelope Creek, of course. Out there, the days had started finding their shape. Zeke mended fence. Learned the ground, where the grass held water, and where it didn't, which draws flooded first, when the rains came, which stretch of creek bank was already starting to erode in a way that would cost real money by spring, if nobody addressed it now. He addressed it now. Didn't ask permission. Didn't wait to be told. Clem watched him do it, from the porch one evening, watched him stake a line of willow cuttings along the worst of the erosion, with the same careful, unhurried competence he brought to everything, and thought, not for the first time, and with a kind of surprise, that hadn't worn off, yet, that Otis Pratt had sold her a great deal more than $2 worth of man. She didn't say that to him. She said, instead, when he came up to the porch afterward, wiping his hands on his trousers, "You didn't have to do that tonight. Wasn't going to hold till morning." Most men would have let it. Most men, Zeke said, and there was something almost like humor in it, dry and understated, the first she'd heard, from him, aren't married to a woman, who moved her well 60 paces on a hunch. Clem looked at him a long moment. That was a fact. Not a hunch. Same thing, where you're concerned. She almost smiled at that. Almost. It was the third week, when the letter came. Not for Clem. Not for Zeke either, not directly. It came to Sheriff Beddoes' office, forwarded on from a territorial land office 2 counties east, and it concerned, in the flat bureaucratic language such letters always concerned themselves with, an upcoming survey. The Dakota Central line was pushing west. A survey party would be coming, through the county, before the snow, mapping the grade, assessing which ranches sat too close to the proposed right-of-way, and which didn't, and the letter named the officer who'd be leading that survey party. Captain Garrick Duval. Beddoe read the name twice. Didn't know it. No reason he should have, it was just a name on official stationery, one more army man doing one more piece of army business, that would mildly inconvenience half the ranchers in the county come spring. He filed the letter. Went about his day. He had no way of knowing that 3 miles east, on a ranch on Antelope Creek, a man was out mending fence, who would have gone still, completely, dangerously still, the way he'd gone still on that auction platform, if he'd heard that name spoken out loud. Because Zeke Cross didn't know yet. Didn't know that the man who'd burned 6 years off his life, with a signature, and a lie was riding west, with a survey crew, and a captain's bars, into the one stretch of territory, where Zeke had finally, against every reasonable expectation, started building something that felt like it might hold. He was out at the creek, that evening, driving the last willow stake into the bank, when Clem came down to tell him supper was ready. She found him standing very still. Looking at nothing in particular. The way he'd looked on the auction platform, before her voice cut through it. Zeke. He came back to himself. Quick. Practiced. Coming. She studied him a moment longer than the answer required. "You get a look on you sometimes," she said. Not unkind. Just true, the way she said most things. Like you're listening for something that hasn't happened yet. Zeke didn't answer that directly. He drove the stake the rest of the way in. Straightened up. Wiped his hands. "Bad habit," he said. "From the war. Never quite learned to unlearn it." Which was true. Which was also not the whole of it, and Clem, who had learned, over 3 years of night rides, with Doc Rourke, exactly how much silence a person could carry inside them, without it showing on their face, let it go. For now. Because the light was fading, and supper was getting cold, and whatever Zeke Cross was listening for hadn't arrived yet. It was still 300 miles out. Riding west. Taking its time. That night, after the dishes were done, and the lamp turned low, Clem sat at the kitchen table, with the ledger open again, the numbers no friendlier than they'd been the week before, and found her mind wandering somewhere the numbers couldn't follow. She thought about the $11 Zeke had mentioned, that first ride home. All the money he'd had in the world, when a stranger's $2 bought him a wife instead of a season's more walking. She thought about the way he'd said I won't have you doing it out of pity, like a man who'd learned the hard way, that pity was a debt you paid back at cruel interest. She thought, and this came slower, more reluctantly, the way true things often did, about the fact that she still didn't fully know why she'd raised her hand that morning. The bank note was real. The extra hands were real. She could have told herself that story and mostly believed it, right up until the moment she watched him stake willow cuttings into a creek bank in failing light, because it wouldn't hold till morning, and felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with arithmetic at all. She closed the ledger. Sat a moment in the quiet. Somewhere outside, the creek moved, over stone, patient and endless, the same sound it had made every night of her life on this ranch, long before there'd been a second person in the house to hear it with her. And for the first time in 4 years, Clem Calloway realized she was listening to it differently. Not as a woman alone, keeping herself ready for something she couldn't name. But as a woman, who had, without entirely meaning to, already found it. She just didn't know, yet what it was going to cost her to keep. 300 miles east, a survey party broke camp at first light, and a captain, with a scar of his own, the kind that doesn't show on skin, the kind that lives instead in a man's need to be right about the lie he told 6 years ago, checked a map, and traced a line west, with one gloved finger. Toward a county he'd never had reason to think about before. Toward a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in nearly a year, and had no idea was waiting for him there. The wind that carried dust across Clem Calloway's fence line, that night was the same wind moving east, toward a camp of surveyors settling in for the evening, toward a man reading a map by firelight, who did not yet know what, or who, he was about to ride toward. Some debts take years to come due. This one had been quietly gathering interest for 6 of them. And it was riding west now, whether anyone on Antelope Creek was ready for it or not. The fever line. October came in hard that year. It came in the way October always came to Dakota Territory, first, as a color, gold going brown at the edges, then as a smell, wood smoke and wet grass, and then, almost overnight, as a cold, that got into a man's joints, and stayed there. Zeke felt it in his right hand first. The burned one. Some mornings now he woke, before Clem did, just to work the stiffness out of it alone, in the dark, where nobody had to watch him do it. Flexing the ruined fingers slow. Counting under his breath like it was a drill he'd learned in the army, because it was, more or less, though the army had never trained him for this particular kind of damage. He found the gloves waiting by the door most mornings. Never asked her about it. Never had to. That was the shape their life had taken by mid-October, not spoken, mostly. Built instead out of small unmentioned kindnesses stacked one on top of the other, until they didn't need words anymore. A pair of gloves. A plate kept from going cold. A hinge that didn't squeal. It should have felt strange. 2 strangers married behind a freight office, building a marriage out of silence, and door hinges. Except it didn't feel strange anymore. Which was, Zeke thought sometimes, the strangest part of all. There were other things too, small enough that neither of them would have called them courtship, though that's what they were becoming. Zeke started whittling in the evenings, something to keep his ruined hand limber, and one week it turned out to be a little wooden fox, rough but recognizable, and he set it on the kitchen windowsill, without a word, and never mentioned it again. Clem found it there 3 days later, and moved it exactly 1 inch to the left, so it caught the morning light better, and never mentioned that either. That was how they talked, mostly, that autumn. In moved objects and unclaimed gestures. In 2 people circling something neither of them had a name for yet, testing its weight the way you test ice, before you trust it to hold you. Ironwood Flats had not entirely stopped talking. Small towns didn't stop. They just changed subjects the way weather changed, abruptly, and without apology, and always ready to circle back, if the wind shifted. Clem still felt it, when she came to town. The pause in conversation. The way Augusta Whitcomb's circle at the mercantile counter would go quiet, and busy themselves, with bolts of cloth they had no intention of buying, the second the bell over the door announced her. The $2 husband. That name hadn't died. It had just gone underground, the way weeds do in a hard frost, not gone, just waiting. She didn't let it show on her. She never had. But she noticed, the third week of October, standing at the counter, with a list of supplies, and Zeke 2 aisles, over comparing nails, that Augusta was watching her, with something new in her face. Not contempt, exactly. Calculation. Because Augusta Whitcomb had heard, same as everyone, about the survey crew coming through. And her own husband ran the only bank in the county, and a railroad line meant land values, and land values meant opportunity, and opportunity was the one language Augusta respected more than gossip. So when she finally spoke to Clem directly, first time in weeks, it wasn't an insult. It was worse. It was almost friendly. "I hear the Army's sending a survey party through," Augusta said, examining a bolt of blue calico like it had personally wronged her. "Captain leading it, they say. Whole crew. So I've heard. Your husband was Army, wasn't he?" Not a question. Augusta didn't ask questions she didn't already know the answer to. Clem set her jaw. Just slightly. He was. Might be nice for him. Familiar faces. Clem looked at her a long moment. There was something underneath that sentence. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, before the sky shows you a single cloud, that particular pressure drop, that means something's coming, even if you can't name what yet. "I expect he'll manage either way," Clem said, and gathered her list, and left it there. But she carried the pressure drop home with her. And that night, over supper, she watched Zeke a little too closely, and he noticed her watching, and neither of them said anything about it. Which, by now, said everything. The survey crew was a week out, when the sickness started. It started, as these things always start, small. Quiet. Easy to miss, if you weren't looking for it, and nobody in Ironwood Flats was looking for it, because why would they be? It was October. Children got colds in October. That was simply the arithmetic of the season, and nobody thought to question the arithmetic. Except Jonah Voss. 7 years old. The storekeeper's youngest boy, all elbows and freckles, and a laugh, that carried across the whole mercantile whenever his father let him ring the bell over the door. A sore throat first. Then a fever. Then, on the third day, a cough with a wet rattling sound underneath it, that made his mother, Prudence Voss, stop what she was doing, and go very still in the middle of her kitchen. Old Doc Pruitt came. Kind man. Gray at the temples, gentler than the world had any right to expect, from a man who'd buried, as many patients, as he'd saved, and honest, mostly, about the limits of what he still remembered, from medical school, which had been a long time ago, and 1 war ago, and several bottles ago, depending on which week you asked him. He called it croup. Prescribed syrup. Told Prudence Voss not to fret, boys got the croup every fall, and went home satisfied he'd done his job. He had not done his job. Because within 3 days, Jonah Voss could barely draw breath, and a thick gray membrane had grown across the back of his throat like something out of a nightmare nobody in that house had the vocabulary to name. And Doc Pruitt's confidence ran out at just about the same time his syrup did. Clem heard about it at the mercantile. Heard it from Prudence Voss herself, who in her fear forgot, or maybe just stopped caring, to be too proud to speak to the $2 husband's wife. "He can't hardly breathe, Mrs. Cross." Mrs. Cross. First time anyone in that town had called her that without an edge in it. Clem set down the sack of flour she'd been carrying to the counter. "Tell me exactly what it looks like." In his throat. "Gray. Like something's grown there." "Can he swallow water at all?" "Barely." Other children in the house? 2 more. Younger. Clem's steady face, the face that hadn't changed for 4 years of fence mending, and calf pulling, and bank ledgers, that never balanced the way she wanted, went, for the first time most of Ironwood Flats had ever seen it do, truly grim. "That's not croup, Mrs. Voss," Doc Pruitt said. "I know what Doc Pruitt said." "A beat." Clem chose her next words carefully. Because there was no time, that afternoon, for anything but plain. "That's diphtheria. And if it's already sitting in your house, with 2 more children under that roof, it's already loose in this town. It'll be in half the households inside 10 days, unless somebody who's seen this disease before takes hold of it. Tonight." Prudence Voss's face went the color of ash. You've seen it before?" 3 winters. Army Field Hospital outside Fort Randall. I nursed a diphtheria ward, through 2 of the worst outbreaks that post ever saw. Clem looked at her steady. Direct. No softness in it, because softness, right now, would only cost time neither of them had. I'm also the woman this town paid $2 for a husband, and hasn't once let either of us forget it. So I'm going to ask you plain, because there's no room tonight for anything but plain. Do you want my help? Or do you want your pride? You can't keep both past sundown. Prudence Voss, who had a boy the color of ash lying at home right that minute, chose her child. "Please," she said. "Please, Mrs. Cross." Clem was already moving toward the door. "Get him to the church. Now. I'll bring what I need." There's a line Clem carried, with her, always, from a woman she'd never met, and never would, Clara Barton, who'd founded the Red Cross, and seen more ruin in her lifetime than most people saw in 3. "I may be compelled to face danger. But never fear it." Clem thought of that line walking out of the mercantile, that afternoon, because she was walking, already, straight toward exactly what that line described. She knew what was loose in this town. She walked toward it anyway. Zeke was mending harness in the yard, when she came riding in hard, faster than he'd ever seen her ride, and he was already moving toward the corral gate, before she'd fully reined up. What happened? Diphtheria. 1 word. It landed like a dropped anvil. Voss boys got it bad. It's in the town already, Zeke, I can feel it. This kind doesn't stay put, not once it's had 3 days head start. Zeke didn't ask what she needed. He'd learned that much about her by now. Asking what she needed wasted time she didn't have. Better to ask what to do. "Tell me where to start." Clem looked at him. Something passed between them in that look, not romance, not yet, not exactly. Something closer to recognition. The particular click of 2 people realizing, in the same instant, that they were built for the same kind of crisis. "The church," she said. "It's the only building big enough to scrub clean, and keep aired. We need every sick child moved there, off their own beds, away from their brothers and sisters. We need rags boiled. Instruments boiled. Every hand in this town scrubbed raw, and scrubbed again. And a line," she added. "A hard one. Sick on one side. Well on the other. Nobody crosses it without my say-so." Zeke was already reaching for his coat. "You need somebody to run that. Logistics of it. Who goes where? What gets boiled first, what gets burned, how the water gets carried, without crossing the line you're drawing." Clem stopped. Looked at him properly for the first time, since she'd ridden in. "You've done this before." "Not this," Zeke said. "But I ran supply lines for 2 years, before the depot. Moving men and material, where they need to be, fast, without wasting motion. It's the same problem. Different enemy." Something in Clem's chest, already tight, with fear for a 7-year-old boy she barely knew, loosened, just slightly, at that. Because she'd been about to do this alone. She'd done everything alone for 4 years, and some old, stubborn part of her had already resigned itself to doing this alone too, out of pure habit. And here was a man telling her she didn't have to. "Then let's move," she said. And they did. What followed was not glamorous. It was buckets. It was boiling water, until your hands went red and raw. It was scrubbing floors on your knees at midnight, because Doc Pruitt, God bless him, had never in 40 years of practice needed to know that diphtheria traveled on hands and breath and unwashed linen, and now, at 61 years old, he was learning it, from a rancher's wife half his age, and to his lasting credit, he learned it without complaint. "You're right," he told Zeke quietly, one evening in the church's makeshift ward, watching Clem move between cots, with a competence that made his own decades of training look almost quaint. "And I'm wrong. I'm too old a man to be proud about that. She'd tell you pride's a luxury nobody in this room can afford. She'd be right about that too." Doc Pruitt rolled up his sleeves. "Tell her I'll fetch and carry. Tell her she's the doctor this town's got. This week and however many more it takes." Zeke organized it the way he'd once organized a depot's worth of feed, and ammunition and men, who didn't want to be told what to do by a private. Except this time, nobody argued. Because fear does something to a town that pride can't survive. It strips away who's respectable, and who isn't, who's owed deference, and who isn't, and what's left underneath is just people. Scared people. People who'll take direction from anybody who sounds like they know what they're doing. And Zeke sounded like he knew what he was doing. He drew up a rotation, who hauled water when, who boiled rags when, who dug the second pit for burning infected linens, because that had to happen too, and nobody wanted to think about it, but somebody had to. He kept a ledger of his own, rougher than Clem's, but just as exact. Which house had how many sick? Which supplies were running low? Which families needed food brought, because the mother hadn't slept in 3 days, and the father was too frightened to leave his own child's bedside to go buy flour? He didn't ask permission for any of it. He just did it. And Ironwood Flats, watching a man they'd been calling the $2 husband for 6 weeks suddenly become the only steady hand in a town coming apart at the seams, started, slowly, the way ice starts to crack, one small sound at a time, to look at him differently. There was an old rancher named Fitch, 70 years if he was a day, who'd sneered at Zeke once outside the mercantile, loud enough to be heard, about scarred cowards standing around, while decent men worked. That same Fitch showed up on the 3rd day of the outbreak, with his own wagon, and his own strong back, put himself under Zeke's rotation, without a word of explanation, and worked 18 hours straight hauling water, because his own granddaughter had gone down, with fever the night before. He didn't apologize. Men like Fitch rarely did, in words. But he took every order Zeke gave him for the rest of that outbreak without a single complaint, and that, in its own rough way, was an apology complete enough for anybody who understood the language it was spoken in. Augusta Whitcomb's youngest daughter took sick on the 5th day. The banker's wife, who had spoken of Zeke Cross in the 3rd person, while he stood 4 feet away, who had drawn her skirts in tighter every time the $2 husband and his wife passed on the street, came to the church door at midnight, with her child in her arms. Her pride left somewhere behind her on the road. Clem took the girl. Looked at her throat. Didn't say a single word about the mercantile. Didn't need to. There wasn't time for old scores, not with a child's breath narrowing by the hour, and Clem had never once in her life let old scores slow her down, when a life was on the table. "We caught it early," she said. "Help me, and she lives. Stand in my way, and I can't promise you anything." A pause. Clem's eyes didn't move off the girl. "Which will it be?" Augusta Whitcomb, who had never once in her life taken an order from a woman she'd considered beneath her, rolled up the sleeves of her good dress. And did exactly as instructed. That long stretch of nights blurred together the way crisis always blurs, until Clem could no longer say, with any confidence whether 4 days had passed, or 14, whether she'd slept an hour the night before or not slept at all. She lost track. Because tracking time is a luxury too, same as pride, and there wasn't room on the ledger for either one. She saved most of them. Not all. There's a girl. Because there's always a girl, in stories like this, and Clem had known that fact the way she knew the shape of her own hands, long before this particular girl had a name. Her name was Ruth Colby. 6 years old. Third of 4 children. Came into the church ward 2 days, after the Voss boy, membrane already thick, fever already high, and Clem worked over her for the better part of 2 nights, with everything she had, everything Doc Rourke had ever taught her, everything 3 winters at Fort Randall had burned into her hands. It wasn't enough. Ruth Colby died a little before dawn on the 2nd night, quiet, her mother's hand in one of hers, and Clem's hand in the other, and Clem sat, with her right up, until the very end, so the child wouldn't be alone in it. Then she got up. Walked to the water barrel. Scrubbed her hands in water, so hot it should have hurt, and somehow didn't, not that night, not with everything else, that hurt worse. And walked back to the cots she could still save. Because that's the nature of the work. It doesn't stop long enough to let a person grieve. Zeke watched her do it, from across the room, arms full of boiled linens, and understood, maybe for the first time, all the way down, exactly what kind of woman had raised her hand in that crowd for $2. Not a woman looking for a hired man. A woman who'd been doing this, in one form or another, her whole adult life. Standing between people and the dark, refusing to let go of their hands, until the dark either passed, or won, and getting up afterward either way to go stand between somebody else and the same dark. He didn't say any of that to her. There wasn't a version of those words that wouldn't have sounded small, set against what he'd just watched her do. So instead he just brought her a cup of water, and made sure she drank it, and went back to hauling linens. Which, it turned out, was its own kind of saying it. The survey crew rode into Ironwood Flats on the 7th day of the outbreak. Bad timing. The worst kind, the kind that isn't coincidence, so much as the universe's particular cruelty, a town half shut, with fear and fever, half its households marked, with a scrap of white cloth on the door, that meant sickness inside, and into the middle of it rides a captain in a clean blue coat, with a survey crew, and a folder full of maps, expecting a routine welcome, and a routine meal, and a routine week of measuring grade lines through farmland. What he got instead was a church converted into a ward. A sheriff too stretched thin to properly greet him. And, standing in the yard of a ranch on Antelope Creek, that evening, hauling a bucket of water toward a wagon bound for town, a face. Captain Garrick Duval reined up. Sat his horse very still. Because he knew that face. Knew it even scarred, even 6 years older, even dressed in a rancher's rough clothes instead of a uniform he'd personally stripped off it. Cross. Just the name. Flat. The way you'd say a word you'd hoped never to have to say again. Zeke set the bucket down slowly. Didn't drop it. Didn't spill a drop. Because his hands, he realized in that moment, were steadier than his chest. Captain. The word came out level. It cost him something to keep it level, and Duval, who'd spent 6 years assuming this particular reckoning would never arrive, who'd built a whole comfortable second act of his career on the assumption that a disgraced private, with a burned face would simply disappear into the country the way disgraced men usually did, Duval felt something shift behind his own eyes, that he did not let show on his face. Didn't expect to find you out here. Didn't expect to be found. A long silence stretched between them. The kind of silence that has an entire war folded up inside it. Heard there's sickness in the town, Duval said finally, glancing toward the road, toward the smoke rising off the boiling pots at the church a mile off. My crew'll need to keep clear of it. Can't have men getting sick this far, from a proper post. Wise, Zeke said. You're not sick. No. Working, though. Hauling water for the sick. Somebody has to. Duval's jaw worked, just slightly. Something calculating moved behind his eyes. You do well, he said slowly, to remember your situation here, Cross. A man in your position. Discharged for cowardice. I could make things difficult for you in this county, if I chose to. He let that sit a moment. Survey crews carry weight with the territorial government. Word from me, and no bank in this county extends credit to a coward's household. Word from me, and no railroad contract touches land anywhere near it. Zeke's hand, the burned one, curled slightly at his side. That a threat, Captain? Call it a reminder. You lied to a board of inquiry to cover your own drunkenness, Zeke said. Quiet. Level. Every word placed like a stone in a wall he'd been building for 6 years, without knowing it. A man died, because of that lamp you left burning. I carried 2 other men out on my own back that night. And you've spent 6 years letting the whole territory believe I ran the other direction. Duval's face didn't change. That was the worst part. It didn't change at all. Careful, Cross. Slander's a serious accusation. Especially from a man with your record. It's not slander if it's true. It's not true if I say it isn't. And my word carries considerably further than yours does, out here. He gathered his reins. I'll be through this county a good, while yet, surveying the line. Best you remember what I can do to you, and to whatever you've built here, if you decide to make noise about ancient history. He looked past Zeke, toward the small square house, toward the smoke rising off the church a mile distant. Nice little operation you've landed in. Shame if it came apart. He rode on toward town, without waiting for a response. Zeke stood a long moment in the yard, bucket forgotten at his feet, hands shaking now in a way they hadn't shaken, while he was actually hauling water. Because 6 years. Because he'd told himself, somewhere along all those miles of drifting, and day labor, and doors closing in his scarred face, that the fire was the worst of it. That surviving the fire, and surviving the lie afterward meant he'd already paid whatever this life was going to charge him. Except apparently the bill wasn't closed. Apparently there was interest still accruing, 6 years on, and it had just ridden into his yard on a fine horse wearing a captain's bars. He picked the bucket back up. Hands still shaking. Carried it to the wagon anyway, because a town full of sick children didn't care whose hands were shaking, or why, and loaded it, and drove toward the church, because that's where he was needed, and needed was the only thing he let himself think about the whole mile there. He didn't tell Clem. Not that night. She had her own weight to carry. Ruth Colby had died 2 nights before, and Clem hadn't slept more than 3 hours since, and Zeke looked at her, gray with exhaustion, moving between cots, with hands that still somehow didn't shake even, though her whole body must have wanted to, and he thought, not tonight. Not while she's carrying this much already. He'd tell her. Just, not tonight. Which was, he knew even, as he decided it, a small cowardice of its own. A quiet one. Nothing like the fire, nothing anyone would ever put in a report. But a cowardice all the same, and he felt the shape of it settle into his chest right alongside the fear Duval had planted there, and he carried both of them into the church, and set them down nowhere, because there was nowhere to set them down. Because the work doesn't stop. The membrane found Jonah Voss's throat completely on the 9th night. Clem had known it was coming. Had watched it advance for 2 days, with the particular dread of someone who's seen this exact progression before and knows precisely where it ends, if nobody intervenes. It came at close to midnight. The boy's chest, which had been working hard, and shallow for hours, suddenly stopped working at all in any useful way, heaved, and drew almost nothing, heaved again, drew less. His lips went the deep, terrible blue that means a person has minutes left. And not many of them. Prudence Voss screamed. Doc Pruitt froze at the foot of the cot, hands useless at his sides, because whatever he'd learned in 40 years of doctoring had never once prepared him for this. And Clem Calloway, who had laid down hard facts, plain and clean, since the moment Zeke Cross first met her, laid down the worst one yet. His throat's closing above, where I can clear it by hand. She was already moving. Already reaching for the small case of instruments she'd boiled twice, that evening, because some stubborn, prepared part of her had known, watching this boy for 2 days, that it might come to this. If I don't open an airway below the block in the next 2 minutes, he dies. In this room. Tonight. The words landed like ice water. I watched an army surgeon do this exact cut twice. In a fever ward outside Fort Randall. I've never done it myself. A beat. Her hands, threading a short length of boiled reed, through her fingers, checking it, did not shake even slightly. But twice is more than anyone else standing here has ever seen. And this boy doesn't have time for me to find somebody who has. She looked at Prudence Voss. Hold his hands. Watch his face. Not mine. Talk to him low, so he hears your voice, and not this room. She looked at Zeke, who had come running the instant he heard the scream, who was standing now in the doorway, with his heart trying to climb out, through his throat. The lamp. Close and steady. Don't let it shake. No matter what you see me do. Zeke crossed the room. Took the lamp. His hands, the same hands, that had shaken uncontrollably in the yard the night before, standing in front of Garrick Duval, went perfectly, absolutely still. Because this was different. This wasn't a threat, from a man, with a captain's bars, and an old lie to protect. This was a 7-year-old boy turning blue on a cot, and there was exactly one thing in the whole world, that mattered in this moment, and it was holding this lamp steady. So he held it steady. He watched the scarred rancher's wife take a small clean blade she'd boiled twice, and make one careful cut, low in the boy's throat, and slide the short length of reed, through the opening, and put her own mouth to the end of it, and draw the blockage clear, with her own breath. And then, the finest sound Zeke Cross had heard in his entire life came whistling up out of that reed. A 7-year-old boy pulling one full, ragged breath of air, into his body. And crying. With the strength to do it. Clem sat back on her heels. Gray to the lips herself now, hands finally, shaking, just slightly, now that the worst of it had passed, and there was room for her body to admit how frightened it had been the whole time. Keep it clean, she said, voice steadier than her hands. A week. Watch the site for fever, for red streaking. And he lives. She rose. Walked to the water barrel. Scrubbed her hands in water gone lukewarm by now. And went on to the next cot. Because the work doesn't stop. Standing near the doorway, unnoticed in the chaos of the moment, was a man, who had ridden into town that evening for reasons that had nothing to do with sickness and everything to do with checking, quietly, on exactly how much damage his threat, from the day before had landed. Captain Garrick Duval had come to the church to find Zeke Cross. To press the advantage a little further. Make sure the message had taken root. Instead he'd found this. He'd watched, because there was nowhere else to look, because the whole room had gone silent, and fixed on the same terrible, urgent thing, as a woman he'd never met performed an emergency tracheotomy on a dying child, with a boiled reed, and her own steady hands, while a man he'd spent 6 years calling a coward held a lamp, without a single tremor in it, close enough to see every detail of a cut, that would have made most trained army surgeons hesitate. He had not expected this. He had expected, if he was honest, with himself, to find a broken man scraping by on a failing ranch, exactly the kind of man who'd fold quiet and fast under a threat about railroad contracts and bank credit. Instead he'd found. Well. He didn't have a word for what he'd found, standing in that doorway, and something in his own chest, the part he'd spent 6 years keeping very carefully sealed off, the part that still, on his worst nights, knew exactly what he'd done, and exactly why he'd done it, cracked, just slightly. Just enough to let something uncomfortable through. He left before Clem noticed him. Before Zeke did. Rode back to his survey camp in the dark, and did not sleep well, and told himself it was the strain of the outbreak, the disruption to his crew's schedule, the general unpleasantness of finding a town full of sick children instead of a warm welcome. He told himself several things that night. None of them were quite true. Zeke told Clem about Duval 2 days later. He'd meant to hold it off longer, there was still sickness in the town, still cots that needed watching, still a rotation of water, and rags and burned linens, that needed running, but he found, walking back from the church one gray afternoon, with Clem beside him, both of them hollowed out, from 3 more sleepless nights, that he couldn't carry it alone any longer. The weight of it had gotten too big for one man's silence. "There's something you should know." Clem looked at him. Something in his voice had shifted, gone careful in a way it hadn't been, since that first ride home, from the auction. "About the survey captain." Her steps slowed. "You know him." "I know him." A pause. Each word came out like it cost him something to spend it. "He's the officer who lied about the fire. The one who put his name to the report, that got me discharged." Clem stopped walking entirely. "He's here." "He's here. And he knows you're here. He rode up to the ranch 3 nights ago. While you were at the church." She turned to face him fully. Something hard and immediate had come into her expression, not fear, exactly. Something closer to the look she'd worn drawing the line between sick and well outside the church, the look of a woman assessing a threat, and already calculating how to meet it. "What did he say?" Zeke told her. "All of it. The threat about the bank, about the railroad contract, about making things difficult for a coward's household. He told it plain, the way he told everything, no reaching for her sympathy anywhere in it, and Clem listened, without interrupting once, the same way she'd listened, that first ride home, when he told her about the fire. When he finished, she was quiet a long moment. "Why didn't you tell me the night it happened? You just lost Ruth Colby." "I wasn't going to add my 6-year-old ghost to that. That wasn't your decision to make." It came out sharper than she'd meant it, and she saw it land on him, and she softened, just slightly, though the steel underneath didn't go anywhere. "I mean this, Zeke. Whatever's coming for you is coming for both of us now. You don't get to carry it alone, and call that protecting me." Zeke looked at her a long moment. "I've been carrying it alone 6 years. Hard habit to break in 3 days. Break it anyway." A ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close enough kin to one. "Working on it." She held his gaze a moment longer. Then, he was there. At the church. The night with the Voss boy. It wasn't a question. "I saw him leave," Zeke admitted. "Didn't say anything to you, because I didn't know what it meant yet. Didn't know if it meant anything at all." Clem was quiet, turning that over. "He watched me open a boy's throat, with a reed, and a boiled blade," she said slowly. "And he watched you hold that lamp steadier than most trained men could have managed. So maybe it means something," Clem said. "Or maybe it doesn't. But a man like that, a man who's spent 6 years protecting a lie, doesn't like being reminded what the truth actually looks like, up close, doing something he can't." She started walking again, faster now, some new resolve settling into her stride. "Let him make his threats. We'll meet them when they come. But I'm done with secrets in this house, Zeke Cross. We nearly lost a child 2 nights ago, because a whole town kept secrets from itself about what kind of sickness it was really facing. She glanced at him. "I won't run my marriage the same way." Zeke matched her stride. "Understood." "Good. A beat. Now come on. There's still linens to boil, and a captain, with a guilty conscience isn't going to stop this fever from spreading on its own." The fever did, eventually, begin to break. Not all at once. Fevers like this one didn't work that way. They retreated the way a tide retreats, grudgingly, one small distance at a time, occasionally surging back just far enough to remind everyone it hadn't actually left. But by the third week of the outbreak, the number of white cloths on doors had started, slowly, to thin. The Voss boy was mending. Weak, thin, a small angry scar already forming at the base of his throat, that he'd carry the rest of his life like a coin he couldn't spend, but mending. Breathing on his own. Sitting up. Asking, on the fourth day, after the cut, when he could go back to ringing the bell, over the mercantile door. Augusta Whitcomb's daughter had recovered entirely. So had 11 more children besides. Ruth Colby did not come back, and nothing about the weeks that followed changed that fact, and Clem carried it the way she carried everything, quietly, without complaint, checking one more time each night, before she slept, that she'd done everything a person could reasonably have done, and knowing, with the particular grief of someone who understood medicine well enough to know its limits, that everything hadn't been enough this time. It rarely was, entirely. That was the work. Through all of it, Ironwood Flats watched. Watched the man they'd mocked, as a $2 joke stand at that woman's side, without a single complaint, hauling water and running rotations, and holding a lamp steady, while she worked miracles, with a boiled reed, and her own bare hands. Watched her go, without sleep, hold dying children, bury one, and never once break in front of the living. A town's opinion turns slow. And then, like weather, it turns all at once. By the time the sickness had fully retreated, there wasn't a soul left in Ironwood Flats who called Zeke Cross the $2 husband. Not out loud, anyway. Not where it could be heard. There were only people now who spoke of him, quietly at first, and then, as the days passed, right out loud, without shame in it, as the husband of the woman who'd saved their children. And that, Zeke found, standing in the mercantile one afternoon, and watching an old man he'd never spoken to nod to him in simple, unremarkable respect, was a stranger feeling than anything the fire, or the lie, or 6 years of drifting had ever handed him. To be seen. Not stared at. Not whispered about. Just, seen. Plainly. As a man who'd done what needed doing. He didn't know quite what to do with it. He decided, standing there, that he didn't need to know yet. There'd be time to learn. But some debts don't close just because a fever breaks. Garrick Duval's survey crew finished their preliminary work through the county in the last week of October, and word came down that the captain himself would be staying on a, while longer, territorial business, the letter to Sheriff Beddoes' office explained, vague in the particular way official letters were vague, when they didn't want to explain themselves too clearly. Territorial business. Beddoes didn't ask further. Wasn't his place to. But out on Antelope Creek, Zeke Cross read the same letter, second-hand, relayed by a deputy, who happened to mention it in passing, and felt the old cold settle back into his chest. Because a man like Duval didn't linger in a county for territorial business. A man like Duval lingered, because he had unfinished business of his own, and Zeke had a very clear idea, by now, exactly whose name was written at the top of that particular ledger. He stood in the yard, that evening, working the stiffness out of his burned hand in the fading light, and looked east, toward town, toward wherever Duval's crew had made their extended camp, and thought about the fire. About the 4 men, and the one who hadn't come out. About 6 years of doors closing in his face, and a whole town calling him a coward for something a drunk lieutenant had done, and then lied about. And he thought, standing there with his hand finally starting to loosen in the cold air, about the sound Jonah Voss had made pulling, that first ragged breath, through a length of boiled reed. That sound had done something to him. Had reminded him, in a way 6 years of grievance never quite managed, exactly what it felt like to be on the right side of a moment that mattered. Not the side history had written him onto. The actual side. The true one. He wasn't ready to let Garrick Duval write him back, onto the wrong side of that ledger. Not this time. Not while there was breath left in him to argue otherwise. The wind picked up, carrying the first real bite of November somewhere behind it, and Zeke Cross stood in his yard a long while, watching the light fail over Antelope Creek, and understood, the way a man understands weather, before it arrives, in his joints, and his old scars, and the particular quiet, that settles before a storm, that the fever had broken. But the reckoning hadn't even started yet. What the town remembered. November came down cold, and clean over Ironwood Flats, the way it does, after a hard fever finally breaks, the world scrubbed raw, a little too bright, everybody blinking in light they'd forgotten was still up there. The church ward emptied out slow. Cot by cot. Family by family. Sheriff Beto rode out to Antelope Creek near the end of the first week, and stood in the yard, with his hat in his hands, which was not a thing Beto did for just anybody, and told Clem, plain, that the town owed her a debt it didn't rightly know how to pay. Clem told him the town could start by moving its wells. Beto laughed. Then realized she wasn't joking. Then took his hat back off, because apparently he'd only half taken it off the first time, and said he'd bring it, before the council himself. That was the shape of things now. Quiet respect, offered a little awkwardly, by people who'd spent 6 weeks learning exactly how wrong they'd been about a woman in canvas trousers, and a scarred man nobody would bid on. But respect doesn't erase a threat. And Garrick Duval hadn't gone anywhere. His crew had finished the grade survey, through the county by the second week of November. Should have moved on. Any reasonable officer, business concluded, would have folded his tents, and pushed the line west toward the next county, the next set of ranches, the next name on a very long list of territorial business. Duval stayed. Told Beto it was paperwork. Told the quartermaster back east it was weather, early snow threatening the pass, better to winter the crew here than risk the equipment on bad roads. None of it was the real reason. The real reason rode out to Antelope Creek on a gray afternoon in the second week of November, alone this time, no crew behind him, just a captain on a good horse, and a folder of papers he hadn't shown anybody yet. Zeke was splitting wood, when he heard the horse. Didn't stop swinging, until the axe head was buried clean in the block. Then he straightened. Wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Waited. Captain. Cross. Duval dismounted slow. Looked around the yard, at the mended fence, the neat rows of split wood, the smoke rising steady, from the chimney of a house that, 6 weeks ago, half this county had assumed was doomed to a woman working herself, into an early grave alone. Whole county's talking about you, Duval said. Both of you. The fever. Some of it. Heard you cut a boy's throat open, with a reed. Heard your wife did, anyway. Heard you held the lamp. Zeke didn't answer that. Didn't need to. Duval's jaw tightened, just slightly. I came to finish what I started, he said. Last time I rode out here. Figured. You understand what I can do. To this ranch. To whatever credit she's got at that bank. To any contract this county sees, from the railroad, once that line comes through. He tapped the folder against his thigh. I've got the survey report right here. Route decisions haven't been finalized. A word from me about, which parcels get priority access, which don't, that carries weight, Cross. More weight than anything you can say against me. Zeke set the axe down against the block. Stood straight. Then say what you came to say. Silence, Duval said. That's all I've ever wanted from you. 6 years of it, and you've mostly obliged, whether you meant to or not. Keep obliging. Don't go telling this county, this wife of yours, any different story than the one that's already written down. Zeke was quiet a moment. Because there was a version of him, the man who'd walked 3 years of dusty roads, with doors closing in his burned face, who would have simply nodded. Would have said understood, Captain, the same flat obedient words he'd said 100 times to 100 men, who didn't deserve them. Except that man had been standing alone every single one of those times. And he wasn't standing alone now. I've got nothing left to lose to you, Captain. Duval's eyebrows lifted slightly. No? You took my uniform. Took 6 years of doors shutting in my face. Took a version of the truth, that let a boy die in, that barn without anybody ever having to answer for the lamp, that killed him. Zeke's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. There's not much left on that ledger for you to threaten me with. Except the ranch. Except her. Then you understand my position. I understand it fine. Zeke stepped closer. Not aggressive. Just closing the distance between them, until there wasn't room for Duval to pretend the conversation was happening at any comfortable remove. What I don't understand, Zeke said, is how a man carries a lie like that for 6 years. Wakes up every morning knowing exactly what he did. Exactly who died because of it. And still finds a way to shave, and eat breakfast, and ride a fine horse, into a stranger's yard to threaten a rancher's wife, over a piece of land. Something flickered behind Duval's eyes. Gone before it fully surfaced. You don't know the first thing about what I carry, Cross. Maybe not. A beat. But I know what I carry. And I've decided I'm done carrying your lie for you. Duval's face went hard. Then we understand each other. He remounted. Looked down at Zeke a long moment, something almost like uncertainty passing across his features, before the old cold mask settled back into place. Winter's coming, he said. I'd think carefully, if I were you, about which side of this county's good graces you want to be standing on, when it arrives. He rode off without waiting for an answer. Zeke stood in the yard along, while after the hoofbeats faded, hand aching in the cold, chest tight with something, that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite anger, but sat somewhere close kin to both. He went inside. Told Clem everything. All of it, this time, the same evening it happened, because he'd made her a promise about secrets, and he intended to keep it even, when keeping it cost him something. Clem listened. Didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet a moment, staring into the fire. He's scared, she said finally. Didn't look scared. He watched us save a boy's life, with a boiled reed, and a steady hand, Clem said. A man like that, spent 6 years building a whole comfortable life on top of a lie, doesn't like being reminded what the truth actually looks like up close. Doing something he never could. She looked at Zeke. That's not the face of a man in control, Zeke. That's the face of a man, who knows the ground's shifting under him, and doesn't know, yet how to stop it. Doesn't make him less dangerous. No, Clem agreed. Just means he's dangerous and afraid. Which is worse? Afraid men do reckless things. Neither of them knew, that evening, exactly how right she was. Because 3 miles east, in the blacksmith's shop at the edge of Ironwood Flats, a man named Teal was hammering out a wagon axle by lamplight, and had been listening to the fever story same as everybody else in town. Had heard, same as everybody, about the scarred rancher who'd run supply lines like a soldier during the outbreak. About the wife who'd cut a boy's throat open to save his life. Had heard, too, because Teal made a point of listening whenever soldiers passed through, old habit from his own service, that the survey captain overseeing the railroad crew had a history with the rancher. Something about a fire. Something about a discharge. Teal set his hammer down. Because Homer Teal had been at Fort Dodge, 6 years back. Homer Teal had been one of 2 privates who'd stood in front of a board of inquiry, and said exactly what Lieutenant Duval told them to say. He'd told himself, for 6 years, that it hadn't mattered. That the 4th man in that barn was already lost by the time Cross went in the 2nd time, lie or no lie, and that a young private's career wasn't worth sacrificing over a technicality about who'd been ordered where. He'd told himself Cross had landed on his feet somewhere, the way capable men usually did, burned face or no burned face. He hadn't known. Hadn't let himself find out. Standing in his shop, that night, hammer forgotten in his hand, Homer Teal thought about a boy's throat closing shut in a church a mile from where he was standing, and a scarred man holding a lamp steady, while a woman cut him open to save his life. And he thought, that man ran into a burning barn twice. Carried 2 men out on his own back. And I stood in front of a board of officers, and helped call him a coward, because it was easier than telling the truth about a lieutenant, who couldn't put down a bottle. He didn't sleep well that night. Didn't sleep well the next one either. He'd left the army 2 years, after Fort Dodge, settled in Ironwood Flats, because it was, as far from Kansas, as a man's savings could carry him, and built himself a quiet, unremarkable life. A shop. A small house. A wife who'd died of fever her 2nd winter in the Territory, and no children to carry the name forward, and enough silence in his days to hear, clearly, every single one of the thoughts he'd spent 6 years trying not to have. He thought about writing a letter. Tore it up twice. Because a letter was a thing a man could send, and then pretend, afterward, that the sending of it had settled something. And Homer Teal had learned, watching Zeke Cross haul water for 2 straight weeks, without a word of complaint, that some things didn't get settled by paper. They got settled by standing up, in a room full of people, and saying the true thing out loud, where everybody could hear it land. He wasn't ready for that yet. But he was getting there. The Federal Railroad inspector arrived in Ironwood Flats on the 18th of November, a man named Colonel Aldous Whitmore, sent out from the Territorial office to review the survey findings, before the route was finalized, and the money started moving. It was, in every practical sense, routine business. Whitmore had no idea, riding into town, that gray afternoon, that he was about to become the instrument of something considerably larger than grade lines, and right-of-way easements. He set up in the same hotel, where Duval's crew had been quartered, through the fever weeks, and called for the captain's full survey report, and settled in for what he expected to be 2 days of tedious paperwork. He did not expect a blacksmith to show up at his door the 2nd evening, hat in hand, asking to speak with him about a matter that had nothing to do with railroads. This isn't the right office for this, Whitmore told him, not unkindly, once Homer Teal had gotten 3 sentences into his story. You need the provost marshal. Army matters aren't mine to adjudicate. I know that, sir. Homer Teal's hands were working the brim of his hat, over and over, the nervous habit of a man who built things for a living, and wasn't used to unmaking them instead. But Captain Duval's under your review right now. For this survey. For the contract money that's about to move on his say-so about which land gets priority. Whitmore's eyebrows lifted slightly. Go on. A man discharged for cowardice 6 years back, on Captain Duval's own signed report, that man's the same rancher, whose land sits along this survey line. Same man Duval's been threatening, from what I understand, over which parcels get access. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Teal. I know it, sir. I was there. Homer Teal's voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. I was one of the men who backed the lieutenant's story. Because I was scared for my own posting, and because it seemed easier than telling the truth about a bottle in his desk drawer, and a lamp he left burning too close to dry hay. He looked up. Private Cross went into that fire twice, sir. Carried 2 men out himself. I've spent 6 years telling myself it didn't matter what we said about him, because he'd probably landed fine somewhere. Then I hear he spent 6 years, with doors shutting in his face, over a lie I helped tell. And now the same officer, who told that lie has authority, over whether this man's land gets fair treatment on a federal survey. He straightened. I couldn't carry that anymore, sir. Not after what I watched this town go through with the fever. Not after watching what kind of man Cross actually is, up close, when it mattered. Whitmore studied him a long moment. Then reached for a fresh sheet of paper. Sit down, Mr. Teal, he said. Start from the beginning. And don't leave anything out. It took 3 days for the machinery of it to turn. Whitmore was a careful man, the kind who'd built a long federal career on not moving, until he had cause, and cause enough to survive scrutiny, and he sent writers to Fort Dodge for the original Board of Inquiry records, and took a second, longer statement from Homer Teal, and one, eventually, from Zeke Cross himself. Zeke told it the same way he told everything. Plain. No reaching for sympathy. The fire. The 4 men. The one who didn't come out. Duval's bottle. Duval's lamp. The Board of Inquiry, and the 2 frightened privates who'd said what they were told to say. Whitmore listened without a single interruption, the same careful attention he'd given the survey documents, and when Zeke finished, the colonel sat quiet a long moment behind his makeshift desk in the hotel room, turning a pen slowly between his fingers. There was one other matter, Zeke said, before Whitmore could speak. Something I only understood myself these past few weeks. Go on. There was a man, who paid an outfitter, years back, to keep tabs on, where I'd landed. To make sure I kept moving. Never settled long enough to be found by anybody, with reason to ask questions about my discharge. Zeke's jaw tightened slightly. I didn't understand it, until Duval showed up in this county same season the arrangement finally lapsed. Man like that doesn't take chances on loose ends. Not for 6 straight years. Not unless the loose end matters to him a great deal. Whitmore wrote that down too. Slow. Careful. That, he said finally, if it can be corroborated, speaks to a pattern of conduct considerably graver than one falsified report, Mr. Cross. A man doesn't spend years, and money keeping a former subordinate unsettled, unless he's protecting something he believes could still cost him everything. You understand, Whitmore said finally, that a false statement to a federal survey inspector, or an attempt to leverage federal contract authority for personal retaliation, is itself a court-martial offense. Separate from whatever happened 6 years ago at Fort Dodge. I understand it, sir. If this holds up, and Mr. Teal's testimony, combined with the inconsistencies I'm already finding in the original inquiry record, suggests it will, Captain Duval isn't just going to lose this survey contract. No, sir. He's going to lose considerably more than that. Zeke was quiet a moment. I didn't come here for his ruin, Colonel. I came here because I'm tired. 6 years tired. Of being the man this territory decided I was, instead of the man I actually was in that barn. Whitmore looked at him a long moment. Something almost gentle moved behind the careful, official bearing. Sometimes, he said, a man can't get one, without the other. The confrontation, when it came, happened in the open. Whitmore called for it, that way deliberately, the same church hall, that had served, as a fever ward 3 weeks earlier, scrubbed clean now, benches set back in their rows, half the town crowded in, because word had gone around by then, the way word always went around in Ironwood Flats, that something important was happening, and nobody wanted to miss it. Duval stood at the front, uniform pressed, jaw set, the posture of a man still convinced, right up until the moment it stopped being true, that his word would carry the room the way it always had. Homer Teal stood to one side. Hat in his hands again. Zeke stood with Clem's hand in his. Colonel Whitmore read the findings plain, in the flat careful language of a man who'd spent a career learning not to editorialize. Discrepancies in the original Board of Inquiry testimony. A sworn recantation, from one of the two witnesses. Physical evidence, burn patterns, timing, the positions the four rescued men had themselves described over the years in letters home, letters nobody had thought to gather as evidence until now, that corroborated Private Cross's account, and directly contradicted the official record. A documented pattern, further, of payments made, over a period of years to private outfitters and agents, for the purpose of tracking and unsettling a discharged private's movements, consistent with a sustained effort to prevent the very reckoning now taking place in this room. And, layered on top of all of it, a pattern of conduct in the present matter, threats made against a civilian rancher's property and credit, leveraging federal survey authority for what amounted to personal retaliation, that Whitmore characterized, in words that landed like stones dropped into still water, as conduct unbecoming an officer. The same words, Zeke thought, standing there with Clem's hand tight in his. The exact same words that had ended his career 6 years ago. Come home now to roost on the man who'd actually earned them. Duval's face, through all of it, went through several colors. Red first. Then something paler, grayer, as the weight of the room's attention, a whole town, watching, remembering every threat he'd made, every door he'd tried to close, settled onto him like a physical thing. This is, he started. You'll have your chance to answer these findings, through proper channels, Captain, Whitmore said, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room in it. For now, your commission is suspended pending court-martial. Your authority over this survey, and any contract decisions tied to it, is revoked, effective immediately. He looked out at the room. The record will show Private Ezekiel Cross's discharge, as improperly obtained, based on falsified testimony. I'll be recommending it be struck, from the federal record entirely, and his conduct on the night of the fire recognized for what the evidence now shows it to have been. A silence fell over the church hall. The particular kind of silence, that comes right before something breaks loose, not sadness. Something closer to a held breath finally let go. Then, from somewhere near the back, an old man's voice, nobody ever did agree afterward exactly whose, though more than a few swore later it had been Fitch, said, simple and rough, well, I'll be damned. And the room came apart, into something that wasn't quite cheering, and wasn't quite weeping, but had good honest measures of both mixed into it, and Zeke Cross stood in the middle of it, with his wife's hand in his, and felt, for the first time in 6 years, something loosen behind his ribs, that he hadn't fully realized had been clenched the whole time. Duval was escorted out under guard, within the hour. He did not look at Zeke on his way past. Zeke, for his part, found he didn't need him to. The town's reckoning with itself took longer than the 1 hour it took to strip a captain of his commission. It took weeks. Augusta Whitcomb organized it, in the end, which surprised exactly nobody who'd watched her roll up her sleeves in that church ward, and do exactly as instructed, no argument in her at all, the night her own daughter's life had hung on Clem Calloway's steady hands. She stood up in front of the church committee, the same unwritten authority, over who counted, as respectable, that she'd wielded like a weapon against Clem for 6 weeks, and said the hardest thing she'd said out loud in years. We've no doctor worth the name in this county, she began, and her voice, for once, didn't carry its usual certainty. We very nearly buried a dozen children for the lack of one. She looked out at the room. Found Clem near the back. You're the closest thing Ironwood Flats has to a healer, Mrs. Cross, she said. And the best thing besides. A pause. It cost her something to get the next words out, and everybody in that room could see it costing her. We were fools last September. I was the worst fool of the lot. There are things, from that day I'd give a great deal to take back. She straightened. I can't take them back. But I can ask you, in front of this whole town, to forgive a proud woman. And let Ironwood Flats be glad you're ours. Clem looked at her a long, level moment. The whole room seemed to hold its breath waiting for the answer. There's nothing left to forgive, that this winter didn't already settle on its own, Clem said finally. But I'll take charge of a proper sick room for this town. On 3 conditions. She let that sit a moment. Every well in this county gets moved 60 paces, from its privy, before next summer. No exceptions for what it costs to dig. Every child in this county gets looked at by me twice a year. Sick or not. A beat. Her eyes moved across the room, and there was something in them now, that went beyond the sickness, beyond the wells, back to a scarred man standing on a stack of shipping crates, while a crowd decided out loud what he was worth. And nobody in Ironwood Flats ever again decides what a person's worth by the marks the world left on them. Or the price some fool once put on their head. She paused. Those are my terms. They're not open to discussion. I learned them the hard way. This winter, so did the rest of you. Ironwood Flats agreed to every word of it. The wells moved, that spring, every last one, and nobody complained loud enough to matter. The sick room went up on the back of the church, clean and bright, a proper stove, and proper cots, and shelves for medicine, that Clem stocked herself, one careful purchase at a time. There was one conversation left to have. It came on a night in early December, snow finally down for good, the whole world outside gone white, and quiet the way Dakota Territory goes quiet in deep winter, a silence, so complete it has its own particular weight to it. Zeke drove Clem home, from town after the last of the sickroom dedication, both of them wrapped heavy against the cold, the horse's breath coming up in clouds under a sky thick with stars. You should say it, Clem said. Her eyes were closed, head back against the wagon board, voice unguarded in a way it rarely was. Whatever it is you've been not saying. Zeke drove on while before he found the words. When I heard your bid, that morning, he said finally, I figured it was the money talking. Or pity. Or plain stubbornness on your part. He glanced at her. I've turned it over every day since. Don't believe that anymore. What do you believe? I believe I looked at you standing in that street, Zeke said, willing to spend $2, and your good name on a stranger the whole town had already thrown away. And I thought, there's a person who knows how to stand for something. A pause. I'd been standing alone my whole grown life. Wanting, more than I could rightly explain, to stand next to somebody who knew how. Clem opened her eyes. Looked at him. I bought a husband for $2, she said slowly. But that isn't what I got. And I think we both knew it, before we'd cleared the edge of town. I got a partner the equal of any man I've ever met. Better than most of them. She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone somewhere deeper, somewhere she didn't often let it go. You asked me once, that first ride home, why I did it. I told you I didn't rightly know. I remember. I know now. Zeke waited. There was a soldier, Clem said, at the field hospital outside Fort Randall. Young. Scared. Hurt bad enough, that everybody around him had already decided, quietly, that he wasn't going to make it, and started treating him like a man already half gone, before he actually was. Her hands tightened slightly on the edge of the wagon board. He kept trying to tell somebody something. Kept saying it, over and over, weaker every time, and nobody stopped long enough to listen, because everybody around him had already stopped believing it mattered what he had to say. What was he trying to tell them? I never found out, Clem said. I was young myself. New to the ward. By the time I understood he needed somebody to actually stop and listen, it was too late. He died with whatever it was still unsaid. She looked at Zeke. I promised myself, after that, I'd never again let a person go unheard, because the world around them had already decided they weren't worth the time to listen to. That's what I saw in you, she said. Standing on those crates. 11 minutes of a whole town deciding you weren't worth their attention. And I thought about that soldier, and I thought, not this time. Not while I've got a voice, and $2 in my pocket. Zeke didn't say anything for a long moment. The snow kept falling, soft and steady, and the horses moved on, through it, patient, unhurried, and somewhere behind them Ironwood Flats sat quiet under its first real snowfall of the winter, a town that had, in its own slow and imperfect way, finally learned to listen too. "That's the best money you ever spent," Zeke said finally. "That's what I told you." "No." He reached over, in the cold, in the dark, and laid his scarred hand over her rope-worn one on the reins. "You said it was the thing you were most ashamed of, and the best money you ever spent, both at once. I'm saying it plain, this time. No, both at once about it. Best money you ever spent." Clem's mouth curved, just slightly, in the dark. "Don't let it go to your head, Cross." "Wouldn't dream of it, Mrs. Cross." They drove the rest of the way home in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it at all, the particular quiet of two people who no longer needed words to carry the weight of what sat between them. Spring came the way it always comes to, that stretch of prairie, green and almost violent, after a hard winter, turning the whole world over in the space of a few short weeks. The ranch on Antelope Creek had changed by then, in ways large and small. A second room added onto the house, through the winter, built by Zeke's own two hands, his burned one included, stiff but capable, strong enough now to hold a hammer steady, through a whole afternoon's work. A proper sign at the end of the lane, hand-lettered, simple. Calloway Cross. Treatment available. Families came from 3 counties, over by that summer, word having traveled the way word travels out on, that kind of country, slow, then all at once, carried by men who'd watched a boy pull breath back, into his body, through a length of boiled reed, and told the story to their neighbors, and their neighbors told it further still. Doc Pruitt, for his part, never did retire the way he'd been threatening to for years. Instead he became something else, Clem's steady second hand, fetching and carrying, and learning, at 61 years old, a whole new way of doctoring, from a woman half his age, and taking to it, in the end, without a shred of the pride that might have stopped a lesser man. Homer Teal closed his blacksmith shop one afternoon, that spring, walked out to Antelope Creek, and asked, plain, whether there was work for a man handy, with metal and iron who'd rather spend the rest of his years building things than standing quiet on the wrong side of an old lie. Zeke shook his hand. Didn't say much about it. Didn't need to. Some evenings that summer, the two men worked side by side on a new stretch of fence, and neither of them mentioned the fire, or the board of inquiry, or 6 years of silence between them, that neither man had chosen, and both men had paid for. There wasn't a need to mention it. It sat there anyway, understood, the way certain debts get settled not through words but through years of steady, ordinary work standing next to a person you once wronged, or were wronged by, until the wronging itself starts to matter less than what the two of you build afterward. They were never, either of them, what anyone would call a soft couple. That wasn't in the nature of either one. But they were a true one, and out on that hard stretch of prairie, true had always outlasted soft, every single time anybody bothered to test it. Zeke mended every fence on the place, eventually learned to assist well enough at a sickbed, that the county half-jokingly started calling him the healer's own right hand, and he wore that name, when it came to him, like a medal he'd finally earned the right to hold. Clem became the woman half the territory sent for in the deep dark of a bad night, the wells all moved by the following summer, exactly as promised, and not a single child in that county went unexamined twice a year for, as long as her hand stayed steady enough to hold an instrument. Years later, when Jonah Voss was a grown man himself, with children of his own crowding around his knees, he would still, without being asked, run one finger absently across the small white scar at the base of his throat whenever the story of that winter came up at a supper table. And it came up often, the way certain stories do in small towns, told and retold, until the retelling becomes its own kind of monument, sturdier in some ways than stone. And there was hardly a child born in that stretch of Dakota Territory for 30 years, after who didn't, at one time or another, owe their own breathing, one way or another, directly or by the long quiet chain of things one act of courage sets moving, to the rancher who'd once been laughed at on a stack of shipping crates, and to the woman who'd raised her voice into that laughter, and refused to let it be the last thing that ever happened to him. Because that's the thing about a debt like that. It doesn't stay owed to just one person forever. It moves. Passes hand to hand, town to town, one saved life teaching the next saved life how to be worth saving in turn. Until a whole county, one way or another, is standing on ground somebody else's courage bought and paid for. Some men spend a lifetime looking for the one moment that tells them, plainly, exactly what they were worth all along. Zeke Cross found his standing on a stack of crates behind a freight office, listening to 11 minutes of a crowd's contempt, right up until a voice cut through it that had no business believing in him yet, and did anyway. $2. That's what a whole town once decided a broken man was worth. By the following winter, there wasn't a soul left in that county who wouldn't have told you, plain and without a moment's hesitation, that the real number had never once been close.